And so there's a balance you got to strike there. And that's something that we've been working on for a very long time, since that first ODMSP of like, okay, if a satellite is in this LEO orbit and we want them to dispose of themselves, where do we find that happy medium of something that is doable, is not going to kill their mission, make them reconsider doing this great thing in space, but also helps keep space clean.
Hello, welcome to the Space Policy Show. I'm Colleen Stover with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, part of the Aerospace Corporation. Today's show is the last in our deep dive series, highlighting our research in the Space Agenda 2025 Compendium. We spent this 6-part series diving into some of the most pressing issues in the U.S. space sector today, and how to advance U.S. strategy and leadership. Issues such as the regulatory aspects of commercial space, the supply chain in an era of proliferation, considerations when measuring the space economy, and advancing science and exploration in an era of competition. Today's show will explore issues around maintaining a usable space environment and how the contested nature of space adds complexities and uncertainties. How do we handle debris from destructive and non-destructive attacks in space? What are the important steps to take now to prepare in terms of policy that's flexible, in design of our systems, and in new technologies? We're pleased to host Marlon Sorge and Greg Henning. Greg leads Aerospace Corporation's Modeling and Simulation Space Object Risk Department, and Marlon is a technical fellow at CSPS and Executive Director of Aerospace's Center for Orbital Reentry Debris Studies, or CORDS. He is also the U.S. delegate to the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, or IADC. He's not new to this rodeo. If you enjoyed today's show and you want to learn more, go to csps.aerospace.org/SA2025 and you can read their paper, Space Sustainability in the Context of Contested Space. Let's get started.
Thanks, Colleen. It's good to be here with you, Greg. I want to maybe give everybody some background on what you've been doing with debris.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marlon. My background is in astrodynamics, orbital mechanics. Obviously, we went to Purdue at different times, and I started in the Aerospace Corporation many years ago, working in astrodynamics. Spent a few years doing some other odds and ends around aerospace, and when I connected with you, started working on debris-related things. Main thing that I've been working on over the last 6-7 years has been long-term projections of the debris environment. We use our tool called Dept, which is the Aerospace Debris Environment Projection Tool. And we've been doing all kinds of studies looking at the long-term effects of different levels of traffic, different post-mission disposal practices and policies put into place. And, that has led us down this road of looking at space sustainability in a bunch of different ways. And that is a real hot topic right now, and I'm looking forward to talking about it. So, Marlon, would you like to give some of your background?
Yeah, I guess I've been, again, my background is originally similar, coming from astrodynamics. I started actually working debris when I first got at here at the company 3.5 decades ago. It was a little bit less of a hot topic back then. It's one of the big things that I've seen that's been a fantastic change over the years is to see how much more in the view of the public and the folks that make the decisions this whole issue is. That's the first step to solving some of these problems, is actually realizing there's a problem in the first place. I've been lucky enough to work everything from some of the technical stuff, doing breakup modeling, doing long-term modeling, short-term modeling, all sorts of stuff like that, to being able to work the policy as well, trying to use what we learn to make a difference. So given the topic that we're looking at in our paper, I guess the first place to start is how do we see space sustainability? What do we think about that? And Greg, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, since there are a lot of different ways to view that topic.
Well, yeah, that was kind of the beginning of my answer, which is, how do you define sustainability? And that's been a really hard thing to do. We've been asked multiple times in the past, hey, we need to see a study on space sustainability. Can you tell me when things stop being sustainable? And, the first thing we do is we ask, well, what do you mean by that? When do things become unsustainable for you as an operator? And so you got to look at things like what's happening right now in orbit. How often is your satellite having conjunctions with other objects? How often are operators having to do collision avoidance maneuvers to reduce the risk of collision on orbit? And, that has some cost associated with it, both with time and money to do those operations. And is there a point at which that gets, to where you can't really continue operating because it becomes too expensive? So that's one dimension of it. Other dimensions are, when the risk of collision with untrackable debris becomes too high. When the environment itself just becomes this feedback loop of objects crashing into each other and creating more debris. You'll hear of that as the Kessler syndrome. And so, we've had to try to break down what does sustainability mean. And we have it written down places, and I'll probably paraphrase it incorrectly, but, generally it's, space operators are able to operate in space, in low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, wherever, without, these roadblocks, and risks being too much to do that within budget and within, reasonable expectations of how safe their satellites are. I mean, would you agree? Do you have other perspectives on that?
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that, for us, of course, we tend to focus on the aspects of sustainability that have to do with sort of managing the stuff that's up there. Trying to limit the debris, trying to make sure that the operational satellites can do what they need to be able to do in terms of moving around, in terms of performing their missions. There's other aspects to sustainability too that we personally haven't covered, but are intertwined with all of this, including things like dividing up the radio frequency spectrum so that different satellites can communicate with each other, and things like worrying about dark and quiet skies. The fact that when you've got enough satellites up there, you can start interfering with astronomical observations. The radio transmissions can interfere with radio astronomy. How do you balance that with all the actual really useful things that a lot of these new satellite systems are being able to provide? And each one of those pieces, although having its own individual aspects, also can interact with the other components of sustainability, sometimes in completely non-compatible ways. For example, you look at being able to make sure that satellites aren't visible on astronomical observations. Ideally, the farther away you are, the less bright the satellites are going to be. So the higher up you are, the less visible satellites are. But from the perspective, of course, that we look at it, what we want is everybody to be lower. The lower you are, the less time you spend on orbit, the less risk you are. So it's an additional challenge with space sustainability for us is that it isn't just the areas that we work that we have to worry about. And sometimes we're going to have to be able to balance the challenges there with both of them. But you were saying, you were noting some of the things that we look at in terms of sustainability in our area. And it sounds like a lot of it is really focused on the operations side of things, in terms of sustainability. You want to talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I did want to touch on the fact that some of the things you were talking about are a part of a more broad topic, which is space traffic management too, which is a big part of sustainability, right? So space traffic management will, if you think about it kind of as an analog to, air traffic control or air traffic management, you talk about spectrum. You have a lot of operators who want to go up, and they got to compete for, who can broadcast at different frequencies and everything. Well, there's also the where are they going to go? You could have all kinds of new entrants, large constellations, startups who say, this is, we've got the funding, we've got the great technology and everything like that. We want to go here. Well, there might be other operators who want to go there as well. And so trying to figure out how close can all these operators be to each other in altitude, because they're filling up these shells, these altitude shells around the Earth with, hundreds or thousands of satellites now, or tens of thousands of satellites, where we seem to be heading with large constellations. How do you space them out? How do you keep them away from each other so that they're not interfering, and not just from spectrum, but encroaching on each other's space? When you talk about doing collision avoidance, again, this is all very operator centric. When you talk about doing collision avoidance, there's the type of collision avoidance that happens between satellites in the same constellation. That operator is controlling all of those satellites. They know where they are. They have a pretty good idea of where each other are at the same time. And, they even have automated systems now on some of these larger constellations where, you don't even need an operator to sit there and tell the satellite what to do. They just know where each other are because they got a computer program that tells them that, and they could do all their maneuvers to stay out of each other's way. That becomes a lot harder when you have multiple different operators and, they don't know about each other, right? The satellites aren't sharing data with these other constellations. It's the same with debris. It's the same with single satellite operators that are sort of passing through those altitude shells as well. There's a different level of difficulty when you're trying to avoid, so to speak, yourself, other satellites in your own constellation versus avoiding everything else that's out there, right? And so when we're focusing on, the operator impacts of things, we have to look at not just how much other traffic is out there operating, how much other derelict things are there, how many other derelict objects are there, debris, just dead satellites, and that's where a lot of the post-mission disposal success rate comes into play, which we really need to be as high as possible to avoid littering. It's also where you mentioned altitude, right? When satellites re-enter the atmosphere, that's how we get rid of them. Satellites at low altitude are getting a lot more drag from the atmosphere, and they come in a lot quicker. At higher altitudes, there's almost no altitude or no atmosphere. Sorry, and satellites can stay up there effectively forever. We think in terms of the next few decades or even hundreds of years. There's a certain point in altitude where beyond that point, things can stay up there for thousands of years, and that means they're going to be a problem for a very long time. And so that's where we need to see improvements in post-mission disposal. So that's something we've been looking at for a long time. Marlon, do you want to comment on post-mission disposal success and the different types of approaches that we take with policy and how those are important?
Yeah, and that's definitely, as you were saying, one of those the really important ways of trying to maintain a sustainable environment, right? And it's completely logical, right? You look and you say, okay, well, the more junk I leave in orbit, the more chance there is of generating more junk, right? The more likely it is that you're going to have collisions, but other stuff as well, things that don't get quite as much press, things like explosions. A lot of the debris that we have up there right now is because the satellites, the upper stages, didn't get passivated, meaning that they had energy sources on board them still. Batteries that still had charge, fuel that was on board, pressurants in tanks that caused the objects to explode. That's another source of debris that is much more likely if you've got things on orbit for a longer period of time. Another one is just the fact that there is already a bunch of little debris up there. The little debris impacts the big stuff, generates other little debris, which then also impacts other things. And again, the less time that you've got these large objects, the intact objects, the old satellites, the old upper stages on orbit, the less opportunity there is for all of that to take place. And, that's really one of the fundamental reasons that there's been a lot of focus on the policy side in terms of saying, okay, we need to get stuff out of orbit. Now, I'll note for most of the time, Greg and I have been talking. We've really been focusing on low Earth orbit, which is, about 2,000 kilometers and below. The reason we've been thinking about that so much is because right now that's where a lot of the activity is. The large constellations where you've got hundreds or thousands of satellites are pretty much all there in low Earth orbit, and in those orbits, you have the option of being able to put yourself into some kind of disposal orbit when you're done, to get you out of orbit, get you out of the way so that you're not a collision risk, you're not an explosion risk. And so there's been a lot of focus both on LEO and on the disposal because of how much of a problem there is there. And it is worth noting that a number of the operators of large constellations now have actually been pretty forward thinking about this. It is in their best interest to keep things clean as well, because they've got a lot of investment there. And so they have often gone beyond just putting themselves in an orbit that would re-enter the atmosphere within, say, 25 years, which is kind of the common universal rule right now for how long to keep things in orbit. And as I said, a lot of the satellites, because they're more capable than the satellites were in the old days, will bring themselves back in a much, much, much shorter time than that. Again, just generally benefiting the whole sustainability problem by getting rid of the junk that's there. Now, it's different when you're higher up. If you're in altitudes above there, it can be more difficult to get out of orbit. And often what's done is you say, okay, well, I don't want to keep my satellite in an orbit where there's going to be a lot of operational satellites, right? You don't want it floating around where it's going to hit other people. So what you tend to do is move the satellites into what are called graveyard orbits, someplace that isn't really used that much, to get it out of the way. Problem there is, of course, you're just really delaying the problem. You eventually build up stuff in the graveyard orbits, and eventually you're going to have collisions, you're going to make debris, and it's going to cause a problem. This is one of the things that we have worked in the last few years. Is it turns out that there is some tricky astrodynamics one can use that can actually bring satellites back from very high up. This option was actually included in the previous round of changes in the U.S. government's orbital debris mitigation standard practices. So those are the rules that the government systems have to follow, and that included an option to actually be able to remove satellites from higher orbits. So there's this constant effort as the technology has been changing to kind of update, take another look at things and say, okay, maybe what we thought was hard in previous years isn't so hard anymore, and we can update our policies to do better there. So one of the things that we've looked at a lot is what are our options for trying to manage the whole sustainability issue in a practical way. And, Greg, you've done a lot of work looking at a bunch of these different ways that one can practically look at large satellite constellations, do things with them. You maybe want to go into that a little bit to just show how much depth there and breadth there is to the possibilities of what we can do.
Yeah, sure. And just to touch on, definitions, one of the things we've been talking about a lot now is mitigation, or really a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is mitigation. And when you talk mitigation, you're talking, what are the things I can do now to prevent there being a problem in the future? It's been asked a lot, what's more important? Do we go after the big dead things that are on orbit right now? Or do we go after all the small stuff that you can't track and that is lethal to your satellite right now? What's more important? I know there's a lot of active debris removal concepts out there, and those are more remediation. So the difference between the mitigation and the remediation is that remediation is you're doing something about the problem that is already there in front of you. Where with mitigation, you talk things like policy or improving the post-mission disposal, not only success rates, but the methodology used. Do you put things in graveyard orbits, or do you re-enter them as quickly as possible? And so the way things look right now is that there's a lot of potential for problems in the future, right? We have a lot of traffic coming. It looks, there's already been a huge increase in traffic over the last few years. And if more large, dead satellites are left on orbit, the risk gets really big. It's inevitable that at some point there's going to be a lot of explosions. There's going to be some major collisions that really start to litter space. And so the question is, what's the right approach? Well, right now, obviously, we want to make sure that we're doing as good a mitigation as we can. The best rules in place to prevent that from becoming a bigger problem than it is. However, there are some objects on orbit now that are, really important, I think, that we get rid of them. And so active debris removal is important. I would say that from the studies we've done, all the things we've looked at, it's probably way more important right now to try to make sure we have less really big things close to operational orbits and close to each other that can collide and create a lot more debris. We certainly love all the ideas and the creativity going into concepts for doing active debris removal on small objects, but you can clean up every small object that's on orbit right now, and then if there's a few big breakups, you're back to square one, right? With large objects, so it's really important to think about how do we go after those big things. So, kind of going back to the mitigation stuff and the question you asked me, and I got a little off track there. We look at things, the post-mission disposal methodology use. So we, in our studies, will vary that for all different types of populations. And we can do it, looking at just individual populations. We can do it by looking at the full, the full environment, the entire population of satellites in orbit, and say, let's have everyone do the 25-year disposal. Right? So satellites move down to an altitude where they're going to re-enter within 25 years, and they're left there, and they are dead, right? They've got 25 years to get out of there, or maybe they're in a collision. We can then also try 10 years, or 5 years, or 1 year. So we're reducing the amount of time they have to be in a collision, and we're also reducing their altitude so that if they are in a collision, they're closer to the Earth anyway. And we can measure the effects on that on the long term. And so that's one dimension we can look at. Another dimension is simply success rate. You may be targeting a 1-year disposal or an immediate disposal, but if you're only 50% successful at doing so, it doesn't really matter because you're leaving so much stuff up at whatever your operational altitude is. And so again, that's another variable. When you have these large constellations, are they at 500 or 600 kilometers, which is a relatively low altitude? Are they up at 1,100 or 1,200 kilometers, which is in that region I was describing earlier, where a satellite dying on orbit is effectively there forever, at least for the time scales that we really care about right now for operators. So we can vary those things. We can test those things. We've seen very clearly that high success rate is very important. Other knobs that we like to turn are, if the large constellations are planning to replenish their constellation, all the satellites in that constellation, say every 5 years, well, that leads to a certain rate of launches and disposals that they have to do. If instead they designed all their satellites to operate for 10 years, that cuts all that in half. They have fewer launches they need to do to keep that constellation on orbit. There are half as many disposals that they have to attempt. So with the same success rate, there are less failures. So that's another variable that we take into account. That runs a little bit in opposition to the way large constellations are operating these days. New technology is going fast, and it's cheap for them to just get their old satellites out of the way and put new ones up. So that's an interesting dynamic there. Along with all of these mitigation things, we can also look at active debris removal. What is the long-term impact if I really have a focused effort to go up there and take out a bunch of the big stuff that's in orbits that are close to where others want to operate? How does it have a long-term effect? And so those are things that we've been looking at. There's a lot of politics that go into that too. So, Marlon, I don't know if you want to talk about, the types of politics that go into wanting to go up and grab something and take it out, or, some of the other interesting ADR methodologies that are out there.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the challenges, of course, as you were saying, with some of the remediation versus the mitigation, because mitigation is mostly focusing on doing the right things with the satellites that you have control of, with the upper stages that you have control of, versus the active debris removal, in which case you're looking at potentially going after things that are not yours. And there are certainly some political challenges with that. It is certainly not the case, for example, that if the United States were to build an active debris removal system, that a large number of the objects that really need to be removed are U.S. objects. So there has to be, to make something like that work, there has to be a lot of communication, particularly international communication, because thanks to some of the rules in the Outer Space Treaty and some of the related treaties, the launching state, so the country that launches the satellite, the upper stage, whatever it happens to be, keeps control over that, keeps ownership over all of that. There's no concept like there is of derelicts floating around that anybody can go after. Not that that's an insurmountable problem. One can have agreements, two-way agreements between organizations, things like that. But it is one of the challenges, along with the technical ones, right? I mean, going up and grabbing something that is, the size of a school bus that has potentially been in space for decades, so you don't know how solid it still is, whether or not it's carrying fuel that might explode when you touch it. There are a lot of challenges there as well. But as Greg was pointing out, to get rid of that extra mass that's been floating around that we left there when we didn't realize what the consequences were, that's really the only option. And there are definitely efforts right now. Several different organizations are looking at doing demonstrations to show that something like this is possible, to go up, to grab something, to move it safely, to bring it back. That is being done with a technology that definitely needs to be developed. So it gives us another option. And I think that points out kind of an important thing that's really been driving a lot of the increased amount of thinking that we have on all of these topics of sustainability now, is just how much change is going on in space. You're looking at constellations that are deployed now that have thousands of satellites in them. I mean, that would have been just unimaginable 10 years ago. Because of satellites that can be readily deployed on almost anything, you have a huge range of operators. I mean, to the point that there are universities, sometimes even high schools, that have their own satellite. Again, something you would never have thought of before. There are also efforts going on now looking at the initial parts of manufacturing things in space, making products to send back. Being able to maneuver around regularly in space versus just getting yourself into your orbit and staying there, that are all just completely changing the way we think about what we do, and all of those things have caused us to have to rethink what we're doing in this area of sustainability. One of the other less perhaps beneficial things that's changed is the contested nature of space. For a long time, it was generally looked at that the space was kind of a safe domain. It's way up there. Having access to that wasn't very simple. But as we've seen in recent years, that's not the case anymore. Back in 2007, China tested a satellite weapon on one of their weather satellites, produced the largest amount of debris of any event that we've seen in history. Unfortunately, it was fairly high up, and as Greg pointed out, the stuff that's high up tends to stay there for a long time and be a threat. More recently, in 2021, the Russians tested an anti-satellite weapon, produced a bunch of debris there as well. So this has added a whole new dimension of things that need to be worried about in terms of trying to maintain our ability to use space in the context of potentially intentional efforts to generate debris with the fact that it's a contested environment. Do you want to talk a little bit more about some of the aspects that we were thinking of in terms of sustainability in this area, Greg?
I like that you touched on the fact that, some of the ASAT tests have been at high altitude, some have been at low altitude. I probably hammer on this, detail so much because it's so important. It's really important that as we're moving forward and operators are, thinking about, how to sustain not only their own operations, but space in general. Where are you going, and how are you designing your satellite to do that? So, if you want to be really low in low LEO, you can get out of there pretty quickly. If you're going to be in a high orbit where the atmospheric drag does not bring you in right away, you have a lot more considerations of what needs to, what you need to do there. Now with contested space, we've seen some tests and everything like that, but a mess could be made with a few quick decisions on where you want to make a mess, right? So the higher altitude you want to go there, the worse. I almost said the better, but definitely the worse for everyone. And certainly, you've talked a little bit about MEO, medium Earth orbit, where we have GPS satellites, other navigation satellites, and then GEO or geosynchronous orbit, which is way up there, where we have generally very much larger satellites. They're much further from Earth. Usually they have to have much bigger payloads, optics, and things like that to be able to see, they're a lot further from Earth, so higher resolution, everything like that. Space is big. This is one thing we like to say. It's even bigger up at GEO, and there's a lot less stuff up there. And we do look at things like sustainability. We look at the long-term debris effects. We look at what happens when there's breakups. We look at collision avoidance up there. It's orders of magnitude easier than LEO right now. But that could change with, if something, if there was a conflict, if that area, and it is a pretty small area when you look at it, geosynchronous orbit is a very specific altitude. There's some inclination variation and some other variations that you see with operators up there. But if you want to stay in that orbit where you're basically floating directly above one place on Earth, there's a very narrow band of where that needs to be. And so making, creating a lot of debris in that region could have really long-term implications that we don't have right now because it's generally, fairly clean. So Marlon, I just wanted to pass it back to you on that. I know you've been looking at these other orbit regimes for a really long time, and you touched on the fact that there's now better ways to dispose. But are there other ways, you could be thinking about the effects of contested space in these regions?
Yeah. Unfortunately, contested space has some unique challenges that we don't run across in regular operations. One of them just being, as we mentioned, the huge amount of debris with something like a direct descent ASAT, where you have a big collision. You can have thousands of pieces of debris that you can track, and worse, you can have tens or hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris that are dangerous that you can't track. It is a major problem, and if you think about if you had a truly contested situation versus if you had just a test, you may be talking about multiple of these events all happening at once. And this gets back to something you were talking about earlier, Greg, about the difficulty with tracking small debris. Even the things that are trackable, when you've got thousands of them that appear, are difficult to keep track of, difficult to avoid, let alone all of the stuff that you can't see.
So I mean, the when we talk about what's trackable, anything below about 10 centimeters, that's where there's a lot of danger where your satellite can die and you have no idea what happened. But you made a really good point that and this is something that happens with deployments of small satellites too. You start to, if they're close enough to each other, you start to lose track of which one's which. You have to have them fly over, a observation station and measurements are taken, and you have to then correlate that to something that's already in your database, the database could get really big. It could start to, really slog, weigh down those computer systems, and they may start accidentally attributing different objects to be each other.
Yeah. And along with all those other challenges is the fact that now we have thousands and thousands of operational satellites, which means more potential things that can be damaged, more mass that's on orbit that can end up dead, that are all a problem. And this is really, I think, one of the major reasons that the U.S. Instituted a moratorium on direct descent ASAT testing. It is just so obviously potentially a problem from a sustainability standpoint that it was critical to kind of make a stand and say, look, we need to not be doing this. And fortunately, there have been a number of other countries that have signed on as well and said, this is really critical. The challenge with contested spaces is the direct descent ASATs aren't the only potential problem. And maybe, Greg, you want to hit on some of the other things that we worried about.
Yeah, we've talked earlier about how important it is to get your satellites out of orbit when they're done operating, or when satellites fail and they're just derelict on orbit. Now they're a problem. Now they're a target for potential collisions. If passivation wasn't done well, and what I mean by passivation is, the batteries were discharged or any propellant tanks were emptied so that there's nothing on there that could explode, they could explode. And so simply destroying a satellite in a contested situation with direct descent, ASAT type testing, or not just testing, but attacks, is bad enough because you're generating all this debris. But simply attacking a satellite with, say, cyber to disable that satellite is also a big issue. And it's also something where, let's say you wanted to disable tens or hundreds of satellites from a constellation. Well, that's kind of hard to do if you're doing direct descent, because now you have to have those delivered to all those different satellites. If you can successfully do a cyber attack to just disable those satellites, you've successfully made a pretty big problem, pretty big mess, because now all these satellites are, again, potential targets for collisions or explosions. And that's another issue with large constellations. Large constellations are packing many, many, many satellites into very similar orbits close to each other. When we talk about, I know I've mentioned these altitude shells earlier in the talk, you have a lot of satellites in the same orbit following each other, but you also have a bunch of other orbits that are, sort of at different angles, filling out this shell or this sphere, and those cross each other. And that's one of the big issues that you have to solve with your collision avoidance within your constellation. But that's assuming they're all active. If an attack could disable a big chunk of that constellation in all these different orbits that are crossing each other, now there's nothing to stop them from colliding and then potentially, making just as big a mess or much bigger mess than direct descent ASAT test could.
Yeah, and there's actually an interesting point there that I think that sometimes people get confused on too. Is you're pointing out, of course, that you have all these disabled satellites. They're floating around. They can, over the course of time, run into each other. Exactly the same problem that we worry about with post-mission disposal. There's often this idea that goes around, oh, well, you could take out a satellite or two and wipe out an entire constellation with the debris. And, in some way that would be useful in a contested situation. And as you pointed out earlier, in this kind of case, space is big. But in the short term, it's not necessarily an immediate threat. And we actually have a real example of that happened. In 2009, one of the satellites in the Iridium constellation was impacted by a dead old Soviet satellite and broke up in a constellation. And there was no chain reaction. There was no taking out of all of the rest of the systems, because if you think about the scale of the how big the debris is, how much space it takes up versus how enormous space is, you can see why in the short term it doesn't really have a noticeable effect. But it's far more likely in the long term that these kind of problems would become really the serious problem. And of course, once you're at that point, there's not much you can do about it.
And the threat of that small debris is really that there's a lot of it, right? The risk of collision with something is it goes directly with the cross-sectional area. The small debris that's hard to track, any given one of those is very unlikely to ever be in a collision, but there's a lot of it. And, as you get smaller and smaller, looking at debris when there's a breakup, the number of objects is kind of, orders of magnitude bigger when you go orders of magnitude smaller in mass. The turning that around, though, the problem with, the potential to disable lots of satellites in a large constellation is these do have big cross-sectional area, and there's a lot of them. So if you can kind of combine large numbers with large cross-sectional area, you're doing a lot to increase the risk in not only in the long term but even in the short term.
Yeah, and this of course gets us to the real point of us thinking about all of this stuff in the first place is, okay, yes, we can see all these potential problems. What do we do about it?
You're listening to part of our deep dive series, going into some of the most pressing issues in U.S. space policy today. The Deep Dive series research topics are part of the Space Agenda 2025 Compendium, an effort by the Center for Space Policy and Strategy to lean into issues already at the forefront or likely to emerge in the next few years. Research on these topics and more can be found at csps.aerospace.org. Back to our speakers now.
Yeah, and this of course gets us to the real point of us thinking about all of this stuff in the first place is, okay, yes, we can see all these potential problems. What do we do about it? Right? I mean, obviously, certainly from the standpoint of all of these new things that are happening in space, we want to keep those happening. They have enormous potential benefits on Earth. And the question is, so how do we proceed to get these benefits and at the same time make it possible to keep getting those benefits far into the future, regardless of what ends up happening? And we've spent a lot of time thinking about that, where we might go, what our options are with how much things have changed. So you've talked a little bit already about some of the ways that one can go about mitigating the debris problem. But in application, kind of talk about maybe what some of the things that we've seen in terms of where we really might go with this.
Well, yeah, we've been talking about mitigation and policy, and these have been really important things. You might have to remind me. The first orbital debris mitigation standards and practices that the U.S. put out was what, 2001?
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, it was just in the very early 2000s.
Yeah. So and this is a really important policy. There's a lot of other U.S. government organizations that have their own policies in place for different reasons. There's a lot of international organizations that have their own policies. A lot of them are, converging on similar solutions. But again, there's no uniform, global policy or law, because space law doesn't really address that directly. A lot of the intricacies of how do you get rid of things and what are the thresholds you have to meet. So before there was an ODM-SP or many of these other policies, the thought process was what we've said many times here. Space is big. We're not doing that much in space when you're looking at the perspective of science, civil and commercial defense. They're just looking at low Earth orbit. Certainly there was a lot of growth over the last 50 years, but nothing like we've seen in recent years. And so without any policy, you kind of run that risk of, yeah, there could be collisions, but we don't really see those long-term effects building up right now. And things have changed. And now we are seeing those sorts of things. And we're seeing that problem on the horizon. So the other it,
yeah, and I think that's one of the critical things that's been driving all of this is that for a long time, from when we developed some of the first policies, things tended to be pretty much the same. The traffic levels were the same. What everybody was doing in space was more or less the same. And that's radically changed, as we've discussed, which has led to the need to think about how do we do sustainability differently. How we need to be more flexible about it. We need to be more dynamic about it in order to get the benefits we need.
Yeah. And so to that point, the other end of the spectrum is, okay, you come in and you set a policy that says, if you're going to go to space, you have to do all these really, really strict things. You must have, propulsion with a certain reliability. You must do immediately dispose of your satellites at the end of your mission and everything like that. So a really, very, very stringent policy. Well, great. You can keep space clean. But you've probably now priced out a lot of operators who want to go there, and we don't want to do that, right? You want to have all of this, technology development and all this entrepreneurship, and you want to see all these high schools and universities and research organizations launching things. And so there's a balance you got to strike there, and that's something that we've been working on for a very long time, since that first ODMSP of like, okay, if a satellite is in this LEO orbit and we want them to dispose of themselves, where do we find that happy medium of something that is doable, is not going to kill their mission, make them reconsider doing this great thing in space, but also helps keep space clean? And that's where the 25-year rule that we've discussed has come from. That's where a lot of the research into should we be doing 10 years, should we be doing 5 years instead, has come from. But all along the way, you have to consider that going to a 5-year disposal orbit versus a 25-year disposal orbit means more propulsive capability, or in some cases, being able to do the non-propulsive stuff like increasing drag, drag devices, things like that, sails to rapidly deorbit more, which again costs more. It's harder to develop, increases requirements on missions. So how do we find that happy medium?
Yeah, and the other part of it, right, that we've been dealing with here is just the range of what constitutes a space system. Right, in the old days, a small satellite was a few hundred kilograms, and a huge constellation had tens of satellites in it, and that was the whole range we were dealing with. Now you're talking about satellites you can easily hold in your hand, or on a couple of fingers even. And on the other side of it, you're talking about constellations that have thousands, maybe tens of thousands of satellites in them. And that enormous range, not to mention all the different ways that they operate and what they need to do for their missions, has really, really increased the sort of dynamic range of what we need to be able to manage effectively, which has also changed some of our thinking about that in terms of how might we design our mitigation guidelines to both accommodate the different operations approaches and what's easy and what's hard for different different systems, and also just the huge range of the size. So I don't know if you maybe want to hit on some of that, because you've definitely worked a lot of this.
Yeah, and so that kind of gets us to a lot of the work we've been doing recently to figure out, where do we find that balance? Where can we find a happy medium of a policy that addresses the problem, but also does not overburden operators, who otherwise may not be able to do that. And so we've been trying to figure out, more rules that are more scalable, that are going to be a little bit more flexible as we go through, and don't necessarily just levy a requirement on everyone uniformly. And so to get into a little bit more detail there, we've been looking at how do you put different space systems into different tiers. Up until now, there's mostly just been single satellite operators and constellation operators. And there's been attempts to define what is a constellation. And sometimes that definition looks like I'll say it, arbitrary cutoff, right? Where you pick a nice round number like 100 and say, above 100, you've got a large constellation. Below 100, you don't. And maybe that's not the best way to do it. But that's kind of, a first step in the right direction of saying, well, there's different types of systems here and they need to behave differently. And so when I talk about behaving differently, I mean, well, the rules we have in place specify things that we've been talking about. Your post-mission disposal success rate must be above 90%, right? You must, at the end of life, dispose of your satellite into a 25-year disposal orbit. Certainly, there are a lot of other options. I'm kind of, not talking about here. You can go into graveyard orbits. You can, do other things. If you're well above LEO, you can do a heliocentric escape, which means going out into basically leaving Earth's orbit and going out into the solar system. That's usually, scientific missions. There's not a whole lot of them, so we're not thinking about those too hard. We're thinking about where there's, tens of thousands of satellites, and we have to deal with those, which are mostly in LEO. And the easiest, the best thing to do is to do atmospheric reentry. And so, we're looking at how do we put these different systems into different tiers, and what if we give them different rules? And the research that we've done, the studies we've done, have shown that, when you look at sort of the traditional historical space traffic from prior to large constellations, that is still continuing, right? We still have research satellites. We still have 1Z, 2Z missions. When you look at those, the rules that we've had in place for a long time are still pretty good rules because there's not as many of them and they're not really driving the traffic on orbit. When you start looking at the larger constellations, you can say after a certain threshold of, let's say, satellite count, aggregate mass is another one that we're interested in looking at. You could even start looking at things like aggregate cross-sectional area because that goes with risk as well. After a certain threshold, they have to do better. Now you have a 95% PMD success rate threshold. Maybe after another point, it's got to be 99% because every tier you step up in, you're talking about orders of magnitude more just satellite count, orders of magnitude more mass that would otherwise be left on orbit if you were unsuccessful at disposal. And so, raising those percentages to, basically keep the total mass left on orbit down is what's important. And that's something that we formulated a few years back as a metric, this uncontrolled mass per year. And I don't know, Marlon, if you wanted to talk about UMPI, because it's so much fun to say.
Yeah. And what we're really trying to do, and as Greg was talking about, is say, okay, well, how do we relate the behaviors and the characteristics of systems to their potential consequences on the environment in the long term? And so that's really what we were trying to understand. A lot of what Greg has been talking about understanding what are the parameters that make a difference comes from that research and looking at that relationship. The ultimate purpose of it, of course, is to help guide where we might go in terms of the policies that we're putting together to have this balance between being able to enable all the great things that are going on in space and still maintain the sustainability. And that's been, I think, a sort of critical change in kind of the way we're thinking is to be more dynamic in that way, to better understand what's really going on, and also to be able to roll in what it is that different systems are capable of. It may be that some systems have a very easy time reducing the amount of time that they're going to be in orbit after they're done with their mission. It may be that other ones, it's easier for them to increase the lifetime of the satellites, have fewer satellites up there. There are a lot of different options that Greg discussed earlier that one can use. One doesn't need to use all of them, but but again, being able to say, well, if I do these several things, which I can do because, the way that my constellation operates, then I will have a certain beneficial result is I think critical to coming to a sort of practical solution to how do we manage all of this, at least with respect to normal operations, right? What we do in the day-to-day type of things.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting to is that, there's kind of like monolithic rules right now, and we want to move toward where things are a little bit more flexible for different types of operators. And I've kind of talked about, one dimension of that, which is sort of trying to put these different classes of space systems in different tiers and providing different rules. You kind of touched on the fact that that's not even just the one dimension. Another dimension could be looking at options, right? If you can't necessarily meet a timeline for disposal, maybe you can commit to a higher, probability, higher reliability on your disposal. And so the idea here is to move in the direction of a little bit more flexibility. And the point really is that, we ran all these things through our simulations. I talked about the Adept tool earlier. We used that. We turned the knobs on these different things where we said, what if everyone has to meet these really strict monolithic rules? Here's what things look like. And we can have a pretty good outcome on the long-term sustainability doing that. But we know that we've made it really, really hard for certain operators. And then we have other scenarios where we say, let's only turn that knob up for certain operators who have the most impact on the long-term environment, and think generally in terms of large constellations with a lot of mass at high altitude, right? Those are the ones that need to have the stricter rules, and not turn the knob up for a lot of other operators that would be harder on. And we could still get pretty much the same good result in the end, but the rules have not made it significantly harder for a lot of operators. And I think you mentioned earlier, we've also noticed that a lot of these really large constellation operators are usually fairly capable. They usually do have these, they have to do that intra-constellation collision avoidance anyway. So they have maneuverability, they have really good, tracking and control and everything like that.
And I do want to again emphasize that the systems that have come online now that are close to coming online, a lot of them are very capable. The operators have definitely pushed well beyond what the requirements are to try to keep things sustainable. The thing is that, as we said, there are a lot of other operators. There will be others that will be coming online, and it's critical that everybody follow good practices, and that we define what those are, because if they don't, it will mess things up for everyone. And it can be a very difficult thing to fix if you have just one operator who is not doing what they need to do in terms of their responsibilities to sustainability. And with all that change, that's another one of those things that's definitely a challenge and an opportunity. So I mentioned earlier there were things like people are looking at manufacturing things in space, assembling things in space, really, really operating, being able to move around like you would do on the ground, having that kind of flexibility. And that kind of technology also has the potential to make what we were talking about earlier, the remediation, the active debris removal, even easier and more economical. As I am sort of obliged to point out, the post-mission disposal, the doing the proper things with your satellite is absolutely critical. You cannot make up for doing a poor job of that. But on top of that, having this additional remediation capability, being able to go up and get things, being able to go up and remove the big objects that have been up there is an important other step that some of these technological changes that are going on may make more straightforward than it is now. So again, that's something that we need to be looking forward to when we're developing policies, when we're thinking about the path forward, is leveraging all these changes that are going on. So there's also obviously the side of this, which is the contested part of it, right? Which is different in the mechanics than all the rest that we've been discussing in terms of operations. And we unfortunately do need to be considering that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
It just reminds me that as important as all of the mitigation and policy are, even if every operator is being perfect, over the next few years while there's this enormous growth and everything is looking squeaky clean, if there's a contested space scenario that occurs, a lot of that goes out the window. And so there's a point at which you just have to say, well, we have to make sure that operators, policymakers are prepared for the possible eventuality that there is contested space and the problem of debris on orbit and derelict objects on orbit could get much worse, even if we are really good about mitigation. Really, just to kind of foot stomp, yes, remediation is still a really important thing, because we might find ourselves in a situation where, well, we got to start doing active debris removal, or else the mitigation we're doing doesn't really matter because, there's been a mess already, right?
Yeah, and that's, as you're saying, that is something that we haven't been doing that does need to be considered as we're thinking ahead in terms of the policies and approaches that we're taking. Is not trying to operate our level of sustainability right at the edge where if anything goes wrong, we end up with a situation that we really don't want. We need to be building that in. That is one of the things that we've been working. We discussed this some in the paper, kind of this whole context of how to think about this, in terms of being able to look at the behaviors and the consequences and actually plan in some margin for potential things that are going to be uncertain. And I think if the past 5 or 10 years of space is any indication, we have to be planning for the unexpected, because we have certainly gotten a lot of the unexpected already. Not necessarily bad unexpected, but things that we didn't think about. And I think we can be pretty sure that that's going to be happening in the future as well. And another consideration with all of the operators too is just the area of communication, right? This is for everything, for operations, for policy, everything else. Communication is absolutely critical for making all of this work better. So with that, any final thoughts to just kind of summarize kind of what we've been looking at, what we've talked about, and what's critical.
Yeah, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground and we've touched on a lot of topics that are critical. I'm sure we've missed some really important things, and we don't have infinite time to talk. One thing that always comes to mind for me is how much of a global international issue this is. Right? It's really important that we set good policy. It's really important that there's a plan for the future, and like you just mentioned, there's open communication. But there's always the risk that one or more bad actors, or not necessarily even bad actors, but those who don't have have not thought through the policy and mitigation practices as well, can still cause a problem that everyone will be affected by. Right? This is the tragedy of the commons in space. Right? There are no borders up there, and so I think a big portion of what needs to be done is more political, or really communication, like you said, is really important. And trying to set a good example and showing the whole world what is important and why it's important. Otherwise, we can't use space sustainably as a world, right? So.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Everybody, we're all in this together. We all need to be thinking about this, and we need to be, I think, very, very dynamic, flexible in the way we think, and we need to be proactive. As quick as things are moving, we can't afford to sit around and wait. We need to think ahead, and we need to think about all the aspects we can come up with, some of them that we can't, including the things that we'd rather not think about happening, we really need to plan for. So with that, thanks, Greg. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate it. It's critical that everybody be thinking about this and looking ahead. And with that, back to you, Colleen.
All right. Thank you, Marlon and Greg. Indeed, space is congested and contested and uncertain. Giving a bit of wiggle room in some of the most crowded orbits by taking action now promises more resilience should conflict arise. To our audience, remember you can read more at csps.aerospace.org/SA2025, where you'll find the paper Space Sustainability in the Context of Contested Space. Marlon and Greg's research is part of the compendium called Space Agenda 2025 that provides insights into some of the major challenges facing space policymakers over the next several years. All the shows in this series and others are available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. Follow us on LinkedIn to get notified and engage with our speakers. Thank you to James Liggins, our technical director, and thank you to our audience for watching or listening.